Hello, everyone. Welcome back. We are truly excited. Armchair ESG with Nate and Yates, firmly established for all time as the greatest podcast ever conceived. I'm Rob Yates, Director of Communications for Owl ESG. And with me, back again, they couldn't get rid of us, Nate, my partner in crime, Nate Giraro, Head of Product for Owl ESG. How's it going today?
Happy 2024, Rob. How are you?
Indeed, indeed. I am loving life. Um,
Good, good.
Agreed.
Happy New Year, officially on the podcast. So
Yes, yes.
yeah,
And
yeah,
welcome back
good.
for our returning visitors, people that stuck with us. We'll try to give you some more interesting stuff and a few more laughs this season too. And to start off with that, we brought a certified joker on. Um, and also, I say that kiddingly because I do like to tease Barry, but one of the smartest and most dedicated people I've met, and someone we are honored to have as one of our advisors with an incredible career in risk management, corporate credit, risk for capital providers, most recently at Wells Fargo. And Barry's going to give you his background as we go into it. But our advisor, Barry Greenblatt. Barry, how's it going today?
Great. Well, thanks for that introduction, Rob and Nate. Really pleased to be here. It's very exciting to be on the inaugural podcast of 2024. So yeah, as Rob mentioned, I have a 35 year, probably a little bit more than that, plus career in financial services, primarily at large global financial institutions. The preponderance of my background is in risk management and in particular in the capital markets area. I was very fortunate to support a number of international businesses, both located here in the US and overseas, and had just a great career working in the financial and investment banking industry. And in 2022, I decided to retire and pursue some other objectives, in particular, doing some mentoring for individuals and small businesses, some business advisory, as well as some not-for-profit work with organizations like Habitat for Humanity. But I remain very involved in the risk management space. One of the things that I did when I worked at Wells Fargo is I co-founded the Charlotte chapter of the Global Association of Risk Professionals, and I'm still very connected to GARP. And recently had the pleasure of hosting an event there where Rob was kind enough to participate as a panel member. So all good stuff.
Indeed, indeed. And that GARP event, and we can talk about that a little bit in a minute because it actually covers a topic, but a very interesting look at AI and ESG and risk and how they all tie together. But today, we are specifically looking at capital providers and risk and how ESG might tie into that. So when we talk about capital providers, I mean, it can mean a lot of things. It can mean a massive bank lending to a company. It can mean a credit card company.
Um, Sure, and I think what's interesting for me at least is I built my career working at banks, which are historically senior lenders to firms, and as I've transitioned away from working from banks, I'm now very active in the equity space, and in particular the angel investing space, which is another form of providing capital. So when I think about capital providers, I think about providing capital throughout the capital stack or structure, if you will, of a company. So if you go back to your accounting 101 or econ 101 days in college, you think about assets and liabilities and equity, and capital providers can attach themselves in any place of that balance sheet, whether it's the most senior lender versus an equity provider. And so it's important to think through, I think, where you are in that space, where you want to attach yourself to a firm, and think about risk in terms of risk and reward, right? So, for example, a lender to an investment grade company is always going to receive less compensation than the equity owner, but he's going to that lender is going to take more risk. And what capital providers, especially if you're providing debt, focus on is both the probability of default as well as loss given default. So those are two concepts that have always been embedded in the paradigm of providing capital, but have really come to the forefront in recent years. So where you attach yourselves to a firm's capital structure is going to it's not going to have an impact on the probability of default. That's independent, but it is going to directly impact your loss given default and alter the way you think about risk and alter the way you think about compensation. So what do I mean by that? If you're a senior secured lender, your first source of repayment is the company's cash flow in paying you back. But your second source of repayment is the collateral that you've accepted for your security. And you can directly look to that collateral for your repayment, which will dramatically lessen your loss given default. And as a result, you're going to receive less compensation for that. A senior unsecured lender is going to take a little bit more risk and should receive a little bit more compensation. The equity holder gets paid last, so they're taking the most risk, and they should be compensated for that. So capital providers tend to think about those types of issues and different types of risks and how they might get rewarded for it. And so you tend to find capital providers with different types of risk appetites looking for different types of returns.
Yeah, just to follow up on that, how do you determine the level of risk that is acceptable, right? So is it the collateral that's being presented? Is it, what are you looking at when you're formulating the level of risk you're willing to take?
Yeah, that's a great question, and one that's really paramount in financial services today, right? And those types of questions are coming from all sorts of stakeholders, certainly investors and shareholders, but also from regulators and such. So I would say a couple things. First of all, risk appetite for a bank is going to be very different than an equity mutual fund, right? So if you putting aside FDIC insurance for a second, if you deposit your money in a bank, you are anticipating the use of those proceeds to go for a lower risk type of activity than if you invest in a small cap equity fund, right? So companies in general will hold themselves out to investors with different types of risk appetites. And so we all are very familiar with depositing money in a bank, buying into mutual funds, buying life insurance from an insurance company. So we're going to, by definition, those firms are going to have very, very different risk appetites and attach themselves when they're providing capital to entities at very different levels. To get into more granularity, if you think about a bank, the risk appetite is first and foremost set by the board, and the board represents the interest of the shareholders. And that risk appetite is then communicated directly to the various businesses and management teams within the firm. And the firm then provides a lot more granularity in terms of the types of risks that they're going to take and how they're going to measure, monitor, and manage that risk. That's typically how a bank will work. Mutual funds are equity investors, for example, and it doesn't have to be a mutual fund. It could be other types of collective investments. Articulate their risk appetite through their documentation, right? Whether it's a prospectus or a limited partnership agreement or something like that. Here's what we'll do. Here's what we're allowed to do. Here's what you can expect your management team, your portfolio managers to take your money and invest in. And typically that's with mutual funds that will be overseen by the management of the firm as well as the mutual funds board. If it's a alternative investment like a hedge fund or some other type of limited partnership, it's generally a combination of the management providing feedback, to the investors. And it's important, I think, to again match the risk appetite with what the expectations are of the investors. Certain investors are looking for and require higher returns, and as a result are looking for more risk in order to produce those higher returns. Other investors are not, right? If you're investing in a money market fund, for example, you expect very, very low risk, very predictable returns with that. So that's really the key, I think, is matching what the expectations are to the capital, the investors who are ultimately providing the capital, and other stakeholders to the activities that you're taking.
You touched on a few interesting things there, and it comes down to this risk reward equation. And I think like what a lot of people don't realize, like when you put money in a savings account, you get not a real high percentage return, but it's because your risk is almost nothing unless you invested in SVB maybe, or put your money. But
different podcast for a different day.
Yeah, exactly. But that's the risk reward equation. Very low risk, very low return. When we're talking about the risk reward equation, and so not at the individual level, because like with savings account, you mentioned the money market accounts, and you can invest in higher and higher risk things. That's why if you invest in like a Latin American startup fund, it'll list a much higher potential return. But if you talk to your advisor, they're going to tell you there's a good chance you're not going to get your money back too. What does that look like from a capital provider perspective? How do they think about that risk reward equation?
Yeah, again, another good question. So I spent my career working at banks, and in the areas that I was in, the expectation was that 99% or more of the time, you're going to get full principal repayment, right? Because it takes a lot of interest payments by others to make up for any principal defaults. So you set your risk appetite, your controls, and your really your underwriting standards with the idea that you're looking for as close to zero default rate as you can get. Now obviously, most banks don't get that, right? There is some risk there, but that's the idea, right? You're supposed to get principal repayment. In my new life, I'm actively involved in angel investing, where one of the question isn't will we get our principal back? The question really is, if this company is successful, will they be successful enough to repay us and compensate us for all the companies that we know are going to default? I mean, that's a dramatically different mindset, where you're going into the equation knowing that 90% or more of your clients or the entities that you're providing capital to are going to default. They're going to fail, and your loss given default is 100%. There's nothing left. So you're looking for those that have the potential to be highly successful and compensate you for the losses that you're taking elsewhere. Senior lenders take a very different approach for obvious reasons. So, and there's all sorts of investors, in between that. I mean, most equity investors who are investing in large cap U.S. funds, S&P 500 type funds, while they're prepared to take some degree of principal risk, they are not prepared to have those investments go to zero, right? There's some volatility in the underlying principal, but they're not prepared to take that risk. And there's investors all along that scale, whether they're high yield bond investors, so on and so forth.
Yeah, that's a great point. Go ahead, bro.
I was just going to say it's something we've talked about on the podcast before when we're talking about the long-term investors who just want a 20-year steady return versus your much riskier shorter-term investors.
Well, that's a great distinction, Barry. Thank you for because when I talk to friends and family, I say venture is a whole different beast. I mean, these guys are probably making 100 bets, and they're 90 of them are going to go to zero, but those 10 others are going to pay back for everything that they lost. And some people just can't wrap when 90 of them are going to zero. I'm like, yeah, but who cares? The other 10 are so successful that they're going to make. The idea is they'll make your principal back plus profit. So it's such a different mindset. So that's a great distinction.
Well, it is, and it's really what we'll go off on a little tangent here. It's really what makes our system of capital raising and providing capital so powerful is the ability to match investor risk appetite with opportunities. Because if you are a startup firm, it's impossible to get bank financing. But there are plenty of other markets where we can match investors who do have that risk appetite and want those returns to you to raise the necessary capital to be successful. And that's why we see an economy that is growing, that has success, has lots of failures, but it's what makes it so interesting.
Yeah.
Sorry, that was a little bit of a
it's a good foundation as we're about to transition into the ESG aspect of this a little bit. But when we talk about startups, that can be a tech startup like Al with software that's trying to change the ESG landscape through AI. It could be opening a corner store, and you're still looking for capital, and there's still like this risk reward equation and different types of investors looking for different things. And as we talk about the risk reward equation, there are some factors that I think have probably been part of the discussion for a long time, but that have now taken a name. And that's what we're talking about here today. So to set the stage, when you hear the words ESG, what does that mean to you?
Yeah, I would answer that question if you had asked me a couple of years ago differently than I'd answer it today, right? That's, you guys are living that every day. I think when we were talking about ESG, we were thinking about the need for companies to have strategies and capital investments that met certain climate friendly goals, if you will. And I'll tread lightly here, but more progressive social and governance goals. For example, promoting and stating commitments to recruiting and promoting diverse talent and things like that. Those were things that sort of fell under the ESG banner. I think that's evolved a bit, over time. And I think if you ask me the question today, which you probably are, is what's changed? What's different? One of the things I talk about, or I spoke with Rob and the folks at Owl about when I first joined was, a lot of the concepts aren't aren't that new, right? I've probably a little bit more gray hair than most, but I'll give you an example. I was working for a very large national branches everywhere bank in the 1990s, and they had an extraordinarily large retail presence, and they began to develop products and offer products to the Hispanic community in the Southwest, and the LGBT communities in throughout the U.S. and they're and I wasn't working in the retail bank, so these were sort of presentations that I'd listened to, and the argument was that these communities, the Hispanic community, the LGBTQ community were underbanked and underserved for retail banking and wealth management products. You have to go back to the early 90s. This was before there was sort of a legal framework that protected LGBTQ individuals. And so coming up with banking products and wealth management products that serve their needs was very innovative. And there was a solid business case for doing this that was never in question. But one of the things that this particular institution also identified was that they needed to recruit and promote talent and employees that reflected these target markets, right? It was important to bring people into the company that could assess products and develop products and deliver products that met the needs. So that the idea was to have a workforce that reflected your customer base. Well, that was long before the term DEI ever came into the forefront, right? This was something that I think large organizations and small organizations had determined long before we started talking about ESG and other types of issues, right? It made good business sense to have these kinds of practices. It was a good use of shareholder capital to have these types of business practices. And so I think we've evolved over time, and firms continue to assess how they think about things like DE&I and having policies and procedures around climate sustainabilities and things like that. So it's really a constant evolution. It's coming to the forefront a little bit more for some obvious reasons, but it's not really that new to people that have been in the space for decades. I hate to admit.
And it's something Nate and I have discussed, is it certainly can go too far if you're willing to make poor business decisions in either direction. But your Hispanic community's example is it really illuminates like how this can be powerful in terms of growing just a business, which obviously if you're successful in business, it's going to lower the risk for an investor. If someone is looking to take out a loan and start a business, and that individual speaks Spanish primarily and comes in and there's no one there that can speak Spanish, then there's a high probability that person's going to look to get their money somewhere else.
Right, absolutely. I mean, we all, as consumers, we want to do business where we're comfortable. That's always been the case, and so companies will endeavor to hire people who can interface with their customer base. I think where some of the policies and procedures around ESG have evolved in a positive way is, well, we want diversity of thought throughout the company, not just in customer facing, right? In our finance groups, in our strategic groups, we need people who can think differently than maybe what we've thought about in the past. And I think that's a good thing, and I think we'll continue to see that grow. I think what I see firms doing is really reassessing, how they want to get to these ultimate objectives. Um, and again, that was always taking place, right? Companies evolve, right? And so it gets a little bit more attention now. But companies were always evolving. And and so um it doesn't mean that companies are moving away from some of the ESG goals and commitments they made maybe 3 or 4 years ago, but they may be rethinking about how they get there and how they measure it and things like that.
When you talk about it from a risk perspective too, I think insurance companies provide a very clear-cut example. So it's easy to say good policy that makes a business grow mitigates risk, but insurance companies, every policy they issue, there's a risk premium essentially built into it. And so if you're insuring houses on a coastline and that coastline is at threat because whether it be rising sea levels or if it, in California's case, you're looking at mudslides or there's forest fires, and that can range from everything from climate impacts to poor management of the surrounding area, and it's all something that gets taken into account, and that's so insurance premiums go up. Barry and I both proud North Carolina residents, and I know I've looked at houses on the Outer Banks, and the insurance costs more than the mortgage payment if you want to buy a house there right now. So when capital providers are making these risk decisions, or these lending decisions, rather, these providing of capital decisions, how relevant is ESG in the context of their risk assessment?
It varies, for sure. I think, to suggest that it's the number one underwriting criteria would be a gross overstatement. I think that certain things have always been in place, and continue to be in place. So for example, if you're active in the commercial real estate sector and you're lending to commercial real estate projects in the San Francisco Bay Area, you're absolutely considering how the construction of a building is impacted by environmental things such as earthquakes. I mean, that just makes sense. If you are looking at companies that are building new plants, you're going to think about the environmental aspects of that plant location. I don't see a lot of people raising their hand to lend money to a company that wants to build a billion-dollar factory on the beach, where they may be subject to rising water levels. There's like a common sense aspect that comes into it. Lenders to retail firms have always considered how those retailers, especially if they are sourcing goods in the emerging markets, are dealing with things like fair labor practices. That's partially a regulatory requirement, but investors and lenders are demanding that of retailers as well. So it remains an issue that's applicable to the company and the business they're in, but it's not the dominant issue. Here's another example. We have many industries that are reliant on carbon-based fuels, right? Chemical industry is a great example. Automobile industry, so on and so forth. It is not unreasonable for a capital provider to be thinking, okay, we are transitioning our economy. Carbon-based fuels are becoming more expensive. They're becoming scarcer. How will this firm deal with that change? What are their strategies? What steps are they taking to address what is a likely outcome over time? And so I think without stating, well, we're not going to lend money to or do business with firms that are active in carbon-based fuels. Those types of absolutes don't really work, but it's more, how do we want to think about, or how is your firm thinking about this change? And does that make sense? Will you continue to be a profitable ongoing entity, based on your strategy? So I think that's where it comes into the mindset of capital providers.
Yeah, that's a great point. Like you said, it's so interesting that the ESG space has been dominated by this DEI, just this one little narrow part of it, the DEI. Like if you talk to people outside of ESG, that's what they, in the public mind, I think that's what comes up first, right? Versus what you just talked about is it's so much more than that. It's looking at the holistic risk and using pieces of the ESG landscape in order to assess those risks and mitigate them. Is that a fair statement? I mean, even if it's not principally the reason or what you look at, but it's part of the puzzle.
Yeah, I think it's part of the puzzle. I mean, I think having worked for large organizations, I think the organizations that were most successful had diverse talent. And more the ones that were most successful, or the groups that I was in, were where we had diverse talent. That diversity, where we were very successful, that diversity came very organically, right? It wasn't a we need more of this, so we're going to put this over there. You had hiring and promotion strategies that certainly were looking at building diversity and building opportunity for employees, but in a much more organic function. One of the things, and we don't talk about this a lot, but I'll bring it up here because it's near and dear to my heart, is for the past 12 years, I've participated in mentoring veterans, active or retired veterans. And the first thing I say in every meeting I have with a new mentee is companies want veterans. Now, you will see companies advertising their commitment to veterans, as a way to look good, if you will, to external stakeholders. But the truth of the matter is that veterans are an incredibly talented group of individuals that add a tremendous amount of value to a firm and to teams based on the skill sets they acquire while they are serving our country in the armed forces. That's just on so many levels a good idea to have an active recruitment effort for veterans. I have numerous examples in my professional career of seeing the benefits of that. So that's just, one example.
Oh, that's a great example.
I mean, there's a number of examples, I think, where it comes up. One of the primary ones, having worked in risk at a couple of big banks for about 8 years, I don't think people outside of the banks realize how reputation conscious banks are. And so if they lend to a company that is then, exposed for having child labor sweatshops, the banks are almost more worried about it than the companies. So, I mean, maybe that's an overstatement, but it's.
Well, I think banks, for a variety of reasons, some of which is self-inflicted, are subject to a lot of reputational issues. But I think companies that are retail oriented, right, are selling to people like you, me, our mothers, our fathers, our in-laws, have to be cognizant of reputational risks, and it's a difficult thing to manage. It's more difficult to manage today than it used to be because there's so much polarization of thought, and I think, you know, we've talked about this quite a bit. I think the companies that are able to develop policies and procedures and strategies that they can articulate and measure and demonstrate, but also provide some degree of flexibility, are going to be the ones that sort of navigate through that the best. I think that you do, if you are in. So let me take a step back. So one of the things, you know, coming through the risk universe that that I was every institution I worked at, every group I ever worked at, was how would you feel if your mother and father were reading about something you did in the Wall Street Journal? Well, guess what, right? I had that, right? I had that on numerous occasions. And fortunately, we were in groups and institutions that even if that happened, I was still fine. I felt okay about that. Yeah, you can go ahead and read about that because stuff happens and things show up in the newspapers, but we conducted ourselves in a ethical manner that was consistent with our risk appetite and what our shareholders were looking for, and I was okay with that.
Yep. Yep.
It's so there was a survey that came out, I want to say December. I was writing about it recently, but 55% of all consumers now consider a company's reputation the primary factor in making a purchase decision. And once you get up to a firmly middle class income level and above, 85% say it's their primary. And obviously, it's a little more complicated than that. You're not going to spend an extra $100 for a gallon of milk, for example, that is somewhat more ethically sourced than a $4 one, but people will pay that extra dollar if they find out something's organic or the animals are treated well, not mountaintop mining fuel, stuff like that.
Well, and I think this ties back to some of the things that we've been talking about around ESG, right? Is that I think we've been trained as consumers to begin to think about how we use our purchasing power to align with our values and things that are important to us, which I think is more than fair, right? If I have a choice of products or service providers, yes, I'm going to make that decision based on the value I receive, but also am I impacting things that are important to me, whether that's the environment or other social initiatives. And the tricky part is consumers can look at the same issue and have very different views in terms of, you know, how they assess that value. And that puts a lot of companies in a tough position, but it doesn't absolve them of the need to think about it and plan for it.
So I think that's a crucial point. So right now, if you're paying attention, there's this sort of political debate going on about stakeholder versus shareholder capitalism. And I think it's kind of a silly debate. So I don't like the term stakeholder capitalism because I think it's lazy. I think good shareholder capitalism means you incorporate your stakeholders because they're the ones that drive the success of the business. The shareholders reap the benefit, sure, but if you're ignoring your community and pouring toxic chemicals and that comes out, that's a disservice to your shareholders. And as we discussed, so Barry and I put an article out about this a couple of weeks ago, and you'll see the link in the comments and flash it on the screen. In a shareholder capital system, the goal is to maximize returns. But to maximize returns, you need to manage those ESG decisions. It's a natural progression. And that's how you build value. So how that's in terms of driving value and increasing it, but how can a good ESG strategy actually mitigate risk for a firm making a case to a capital provider?
Well, you got a couple different levels, right? So an obvious one is, you know, the regulatory environment is changing, right? You certainly have Europe being a little bit further ahead and more aggressive in some of their environmental and sustainability issues. But the U.S. is getting there, and we're starting to see more there. It's as simple as if you have regulatory requirements and you fail to meet them, you are going to be fined. You are going to be prevented. You are going to pay money to somebody other than your shareholders. Pretty cut and dried in terms of how it adds value. What's more difficult to do, but just as important, is how does it impact how we attract employees to work at our firm? And so, some of it's generational, right? I have children that are had just entered the workforce, and what's important to them is very different than what was important to me coming out of school a few decades ago. And so if you're going to attract talent, you need to think about, well, why would a young, talented person want to come work for my company? What are the things that they're looking for? And if it's not just cash compensation, what are the other things? And that it could be commitment to communities, commitment to sustainability. Will I have the opportunity, if I don't look like my hiring manager, will I have the opportunity to grow my career here and be successful? All those things play into the success of a company that ultimately is going to develop products and services, grow customers, generate a return that ultimately gets passed on to the owners of the company or the shareholders. And I think that was the case 30 years ago. It's the case today. Some of the criteria has changed, but the thought process behind it remains consistent.
So go ahead, Rob.
Well, to just one follow-up point, I think the hiring practices is a really critical element. So we had Liz Simeon last season, and she was talking about how some of the labor practices really make a difference. And some of the stuff we're discussing gets tied to progressive politics, but I think there's actually a huge influence in more traditional politics. So for example, women who want to start a family want to see there's a really good maternity leave policy. So they can go and they know they can build their careers, but they can also have a family. Or things like what are the childcare provisions? What are the health provisions? Those make a big difference.
I completely agree, and I think you see a lot of large organizations do things like having community days. Look, it's great PR to have 100 or so of your employees out there wearing a t-shirt doing community projects. But I got to tell you, I worked on those projects, and it was great team building, and it really was impactful to the people who participated. It was something that they cared about. They wanted to work for an organization that supported them in those efforts. Give you another example. Charitable giving. Lots of big financial institutions want to publicize how much charitable giving their employees are doing. It's good for their business model. I get that. But on the flip side, employees want to know that their company is supporting them, matching grants. One company I worked for, they encouraged employees to donate money to whatever not-for-profit institution was impactful to them in their communities. So they really pushed it down to the most granular level that they could, so that the charitable giving was reflective of the goals and values of their employees. And as a manager, I was very clear with my employees, and I said, look, the things that are important to you are probably not going to be important to me, and vice versa. That's not the point. The point is we have an opportunity to really help and support those things that are important to us as individuals. And I think that's a big part of diversity, equity, and inclusion, for example, is providing the means to do that. That doesn't have to be controversial at all.
Yeah. So Barry, what's been great about listening to you today is you providing what this has looked like in the past, right? 30 years ago today. Where do you see this going in the future? Where do you see the landscape, of ESG and capital investment, or just in general? Where do you see this going?
Yeah, that's that's the hardest question you've asked. Um, uh, so I don't know exactly. I think the ebb and flow, right, changes, right? I think we had a lot of companies coming out with lots of absolutes, lots of very strong statements, which very ambitious goals, and there's value in that. Look, if you don't think big, you're not going to get there. But then we learn, right? Then we have experience, and we start to make some changes. So I think we're seeing that, for example, in electronic vehicles, right? And how these large companies are thinking about their commitment to the transition away from carbon fuels, and frankly, how we get there, right? So um, it may not be as easy to mass produce electronic vehicles and flood our dealerships and rental car companies and others with EV only vehicles if there is not the infrastructure to support that, or the perception of clients that infrastructure exists. So what happens? Well, maybe we take a slightly different approach. Maybe we come up with other technologies, other products that lead us in that direction, whether it's hybrid vehicles, plug-in hybrids, or some other technologies that allow us to get to a more carbon-friendly environment. As a capital provider, you have to think about that, right? You have to really think about that. So if you're lending to a company that has a very clear strategy on one side or the other, you got to think about if they're wrong and their ability to make adjustments and how that's going to impact your returns. And again, that's always been the case, right? I'm sure there were lenders many years ago to Eastman Kodak that weren't thinking about what happens if digital photography takes off. But at some point, those capital providers had to think about those types of issues. And we see things changing. So I absolutely believe that firms will continue to have a strong commitment to things like sustainability and DE&I. How they get there and how they measure it, that might change.
Yeah, I was sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
No, go ahead.
No, I was going to say there's been some articles that have come out. Maybe you've seen them in the last few weeks. Wall Street Journal about how ESG's the corporate dirty word was one article, and then there was one with another large asset manager about ESG. And I got some text from Rob, even from some of our people that customers, and they said, "What do you think about this?" And I said, "Oh, it's always going to be there. It might change to a different name, but those elements that we're looking at in some shape or form will continue to be looked at, in my opinion. We might change the name around them or the reporting around them, but I believe they will be there. And just like, in the capital markets, is creative destruction is, you talk about Kodak or even Amazon, right? What they did to bookstores, right? Brick and mortar bookstores. There's always going to be a change in the landscape, but I think when it comes to assessing risk or looking at these elements around ES and G, you're going to see that. It's just, it might just sound different. I don't know what you think about that, but that's how I responded
I
to
no,
those.
I 100% agree, right?
All
So yeah, I think I read those articles, and there were some politicians that were cheering that on. Oh, we've killed
Yeah.
this. No, you haven't. You haven't,
Mhm.
right? It's not as though that company that was considering building a plant near a coastline is all of a sudden going to build that plant. No, they're not. They're not going to get any funding for that, because everybody who's lending money is thinking about, well, what happens if water levels rise, right? It hasn't changed. Um, I don't know about your neighborhood, but in my neighborhood, Amazon is now delivering all of their package with electronic only vans. Why are they doing that? I'm not exactly sure. It could be because some of their clients or potential customers were sort of thinking about, well, what's the carbon impact of constantly ordering from Amazon? It's also possible that they just looked at the dollars and cents and said, it's going to be a lot less expensive for us over time to fuel our vehicles electronically than using carbon-based fuels. I honestly, I don't know the answer to that question. But obviously Amazon's thinking about it, right? That hasn't changed. And they're acting on it. And if you look at any companies, large companies, hiring websites, you're going to see pictures of lots of different types of people who look very, very different from one another. That's not by accident. There's a reason why they're doing that. It doesn't, the fact that they may be calling it something different doesn't change the fundamental issue that we want to attract the best and the brightest, and we want the best and the brightest to feel as though they can come here and have a successful career. And that remains.
So that's actually, I got one last question tailing off of that. As you look at, so the Amazon is a good example, because I would be willing to bet a lot of money and feel like it would be a very low risk that Amazon's not losing a ton going electric over time. Like, somebody looked at the financial impact of that decision. But you mentioned the hiring practices earlier, and then you talk about the hiring website. So on that note, what would your advice be to someone who is just entering the work world? What do you tell your kids who wanted a specific type of company, a specific type of impact, but also want to make money? I mean, none of us are working just for the fun of it.
Well, first of all, I don't tell my kids anything because they don't
But
listen.
that's fair. All right, I'll take that. I can empathize there.
But I do work with quite a few people as a mentor, and I do think, and long before we were talking about DE&I and ESG, I always encourage people to think about cultural fit, right? And what types of things will resonate with you and will motivate you. And one firm I worked for had a very dynamic CEO when I first got there. And he used to talk about the trains at the station, you can get on or stay in the station. And at first I thought, well, that's a bit aggressive to people. And then I thought, he's absolutely right. He has done his job. He has articulated exactly where this train is going, and how it's going to get there. And each of us has a choice. And we can get on the train if that all makes sense to us and we like where that train is going, or not, and go someplace else. But I began to really appreciate the fact that was very apparent. And there were lots of good people who didn't get on the train, right? They went some other place. And that was good for everybody. It was good for the people. It was good for our firm. It was good for me. So I think that you ought to look at places that meet your objectives. There are firms out there that do not care about any of the things that we're talking about. They care about how much money they can make and how much they can pay their people. If that's important to you, then you should go there. And I've had people say, that's the place I want to work. For the 8, 10, 12 hours a day that I'm working, I want to maximize my return. And I'm going to go influence my values on the weekends or at night. And that's fine, right? You should know that going in. And then there are other places where that's not as important, and they want to be able to impact certain things and their values while they're working, and you should know that going in. So what I do advise people is think about the company that you're working for. Talk to other people that are there. Does it align with your own value set, with your own work ethic? And will you feel comfortable waking up in the morning going to work there? Really good companies may not check those boxes for you, and that's perfectly fine, right? Again, it's a great thing about our economy is we have those choices.
I love how you put that, Barry. It's not a zero-sum game, right?
Yeah, yeah.
I like that.
Oh, it's absolutely not a zero-sum game, and I think that and look, companies change over time. I've left companies because I saw that their culture was changing, and it didn't make sense to me. For me personally, it certainly made sense, but it just didn't make sense for me personally. And I'm thinking, well, it's probably time to move on. It's time to get off that train. And that company continued to be very successful. And a lot of my friends and colleagues who stayed had very successful careers. That was a great decision on my part. Great decision on the company's part, right? They decided they needed to move in another direction. So that's all good.
Yep.
So I think that's great advice to leave the kids with. Look at the train, decide if the ticket price is right, and then peek on the inside. If it's decorated 18th century Victorian and that's not your style, then maybe wait for the next train.
And it's going to where you're planning on wanting to go.
Hey, I love this discussion. It's I definitely want to get you back on the podcast too, because this is something that's not going away. It's becoming more and more relevant. And as you mentioned at the beginning, it's sort of a fundamental aspect of what drives our economic system. And as these considerations become more prominent for the ultimate consumer, they will very much become magnified for the people providing the capital to the firms.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely correct. I mean, again, if you're providing capital, right? If you're taking risk, you really do expect the entity that's accepting the capital to have considered all of the risks that will impact their business. There are competitive risks. There's the creative destruction that Nate mentioned earlier. But there are ESG risks that are prevalent, and you want to know that the firm that you're providing capital to has thought about them, and that their strategies around mitigating those risks make sense. Doesn't mean they can eliminate all of them, but that they make sense, and that the risk that you're taking aligns with your own risk appetite.
There it is. And we will watch this as it develops. Barry, thank you so much for coming on today.
Yeah, thanks, Barry. That was awesome.
Yeah,
Awesome.
Happy to be here.
Mr. Gerard, talk to you very soon. To everyone else, thank you. As always, remember, like, subscribe, do all the YouTube and Spotify things. And thank you for watching. It's pretty cool that people care at least a little bit about what we have to say. So we appreciate you very much. Everyone, have a wonderful rest of your day.